Okay, wow. You've sent us like a mountain of research on how China has been acquiring intellectual property, especially from the West. So, it looks like we're going deep on industrial espionage, hacking, all sorts of, well, a lot more. I mean, this isn't just about, someone copying a handbag design or something. This is serious stuff with big economic and technological impacts, right?
Yeah, absolutely. What's fascinating is that they've got a real playbook, so to
Mm.
speak, of tactics that they've been using for decades now.
Mm.
And it's not always that smash and grab kind of theft. It's much more strategic. They've been playing the long game, using sometimes pretty subtle strategy to gain a technological edge.
A playbook, huh? Okay, I'm intrigued. So, where do we start flipping through the pages of this playbook? Where do we even begin?
Well, let's rewind a bit. Back to the 80s and 90s when China was really opening up its markets. Western companies were, they were practically tripping over themselves to get in on that action. It was a huge growing market.
Right. Yeah, a massive potential customer base. I mean, who wouldn't want a slice of that pie?
Exactly. And China knew that. They leveraged that eagerness. They made joint ventures with local Chinese firms mandatory for any foreign company that wanted to do business there.
So it wasn't just about finding a partner, there were strings attached.
Oh, yeah, big time. These joint ventures, they often came with a pretty hefty price tag. Foreign companies, they were required to share their technology, their know-how. Essentially, it was a forced transfer of intellectual property.
It's like, hey, you want to play in our market? Sure, but the entrance fee is your company's secret sauce.
Exactly. And this wasn't just any secret sauce. This was, core technologies, manufacturing processes, the kind of stuff that gives companies their competitive advantage. And Chinese firms, well, they were quick studies. They took that tech, they absorbed it, adapted it, and boom, they had their own versions without having to go through all those decades of research and development.
It's like a shortcut.
Yeah.
Did this impact like certain industries more than others?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the automotive industry is a prime example. You look at the rise of Chinese car manufacturers, a lot of their early growth, you can trace it right back to these forced technology transfers. They got access to, engine designs, manufacturing techniques, all sorts of valuable IP that helped them build up a globally competitive industry.
Okay, so forced joint ventures, that's like page one of the playbook. What else have we got?
Well, let's turn to another tactic, reverse engineering. This one might be a bit more familiar. We've all heard the stories about, those knockoff electronics, right?
Oh yeah, counterfeit iPhones, fake designer bags. It's like a whole industry in itself.
Right, exactly. But, the research shows that it goes way beyond those consumer goods. We're talking about military technology as well. Specifically cases where American aircraft, even advanced weaponry, were reverse engineered to boost China's own defense capabilities.
Whoa, seriously. So like taking apart a fighter jet to see how it ticks, that's a whole other level. Are there any like specific examples from the research that really stand out?
Yeah, one that's often cited is the J-20, which is China's fifth-generation stealth fighter. Some experts, they believe that its development was, well, significantly aided by the acquisition of technology through, this reverse engineering. Specifically, they point to similarities in its design to the American F-22 and F-35. Now, it's tough to prove those direct links in these cases, but the similarities and the rapid progress that China made in this area, it definitely raises some eyebrows.
Yeah, that's a pretty big leap, going from copying consumer electronics to dissecting advanced weaponry. It makes you wonder, how do they even get their hands on this stuff in the first place?
Well, that leads us to the next page in this playbook, and that is cyber espionage. This is where things get really, really interesting and a lot more complex.
Okay, this is the part where we like picture shadowy figures hunched over computers hacking into like top secret databases.
Yeah, there's definitely some truth to that image. But remember, cyber espionage, it's a lot harder to track and prove than, someone walking out of a factory with the stolen blueprint. It's like a digital ghost story, right? Where the evidence is often hidden in lines of code.
And the potential damage is huge, I imagine. I mean, stealing a company's entire research database, that could set them back years.
Oh, absolutely. One example that really sent shockwaves through the industry was that 2014 hacking of major U.S. companies, like Boeing and Lockheed Martin. The hackers, they were allegedly linked to China, and they stole terabytes of data related to highly sensitive aerospace and defense technology. I'm talking design, specifications, even source code.
Wait, those are giants in aerospace and defense. That must have been a major blow. Does the research, does it say what kind of information was taken?
Well, according to the research, one of the biggest targets was the C-17 Globemaster III. It's a massive military transport aircraft. The hackers were able to access detailed technical drawings, performance data, even information on potential vulnerabilities. I mean, this kind of information is incredibly valuable. It can be used to, develop competing products, identify weaknesses in existing systems, or even inform future cyber attacks.
So it's not just about stealing designs, it's about gaining a strategic advantage. This playbook is, it's starting to sound pretty scary.
And it doesn't stop there. Remember the 2015 data breach of the Office of Personnel Management, or OPM, in the United States?
Hmm.
Millions of Americans' personal data, I mean, social security numbers, security clearance information, even fingerprint data, it was all exposed.
Yeah, that was a huge one. Wasn't that linked to China as well?
Well, the full motive is still debated, but some experts, they do believe that it was part of a larger Chinese intelligence operation. The data could be used for, various purposes, identifying potential recruits, blackmail, even gaining leverage in negotiations. It's a stark reminder that cyber espionage, it can have far-reaching consequences affecting not just companies, but, individuals and national security.
It's like a digital arms race.
Yeah.
As companies and governments build up their defenses, the hackers are just finding new ways to break in. So we've got forced joint ventures, reverse engineering, now cyber espionage. What other tactics are in this playbook?
Well, sometimes it's not even about being sneaky. The research is full of examples of Chinese companies just blatantly violating Western patents and trademarks. I'm talking straight up counterfeiting.
Like those fake designer bags we mentioned before,
Of
or
course.
those knockoff iPhones that are practically indistinguishable from the real deal.
Exactly. The Shanzai phenomenon, as it's known, was a prime example of this. And, it wasn't just about making those cheap copies. There was a sort of culture of adaptation and remixing, right?
Ah.
Taking existing products and tweaking them, sometimes even improving on them. It's a fascinating mix of innovation and imitation.
So more than just straightforward counterfeiting, there's like a cultural element to it.
Absolutely. It reflects a certain, entrepreneurial spirit, a willingness to experiment, to adapt, which has in some ways contributed to China's rapid technological development. But of course, there's a darker side to Shanzai as well, right? It undermines legitimate businesses, it erodes brand value, and when it comes to things like counterfeit pharmaceuticals, it can even pose serious safety risks.
So a double-edged sword, a sign of both ingenuity and a disregard for intellectual property rights.
Precisely.
Hmm.
And this blatant counterfeiting, it's had a very real impact on Western companies. Think about it. If someone can buy a knockoff version of your product for, a fraction of the price, it undermines your entire business model. It erodes brand value, reduces profits, and it creates a very unfair playing field.
So it's not just a legal issue, it's an economic one, too. It makes you wonder how this went on for so long. Why didn't Western companies or governments do more to, stop it?
Well, that's a complex question, and there are no easy answers. Part of it was the challenge of, enforcing intellectual property rights in a vast, rapidly developing country like China. You had issues with corruption, weak legal frameworks, and a lack of political will to really crack down on these practices.
Sounds like a perfect storm for IP theft. But
Yeah.
has the situation improved at all?
There's been some progress, yes. China has been strengthening its intellectual property laws and enforcement mechanisms in recent years, especially as they've become more focused on, developing their own innovative industries. They're starting to realize that respecting intellectual property, well, in their own best interest as well.
So it's like they're becoming the victim of their own success. Now that they're creating valuable IP, they're more motivated to protect it.
Exactly. But it's still an ongoing process,
Right.
and the international community continues to push for stronger IP protection in China, recognizing its importance for, fair trade and global innovation.
Okay, so we've covered forced joint ventures, reverse engineering, cyber espionage, and blatant counterfeiting. This playbook is getting pretty thick. Are there any other tactics we need to be aware of?
Well, this next one might surprise you. China's also strategically leveraged education and talent recruitment as a pathway to acquire intellectual property.
Really? I'm not sure I follow. How does that work?
It's a subtle but effective strategy. Think about the thousands of Chinese students and scientists who study abroad, right? In Western universities, research institutions. They gain access to cutting-edge knowledge, they work in world-class labs, they build these valuable networks.
So they're absorbing knowledge like sponges and then taking it back to China.
Precisely. And it's not just students. Chinese firms are actively recruiting experienced Western professionals. sometimes luring them with, big salaries, leadership positions to gain access to their expertise, their networks.
So like importing brains instead of stealing products. That's pretty clever.
It is, and it's been quite effective in, in helping China build up its own talent pool and innovation capacity in key sectors. It's a long-term investment that's starting to pay off.
Wow, this playbook is more sophisticated than I imagined. They're not just playing defense, they're actively building up their own offensive capabilities.
Exactly. And all of this, it ties into their larger ambitions for, global economic and technological dominance. We can't talk about this without mentioning Made in China 2025, which was their ambitious plan to become a global leader in high-tech industries.
Right, that was a huge initiative. So is the research suggesting that all of these IP acquisition tactics, that they were all part of a larger strategy to achieve the goals of Made in China 2025?
It's certainly one interpretation. The research shows that acquiring intellectual property, whether it's through, forced technology transfer, cyber espionage, or other means, it was seen as a crucial ingredient in achieving their goal of becoming a global superpower in innovation.
Okay, so they were playing catch up, and they use a variety of strategies, some more controversial than others, to accelerate their progress. It's a complex issue.
Absolutely, and it raises a lot of important questions. What are the implications of these actions for Western companies? How should governments respond? And what does this all mean for the future of global innovation?
Yeah, we've definitely uncovered a lot to unpack here, but it feels like we're just scratching the surface.
You're right. There's a lot more to discuss.
So before we took a pause there, we were going through this metaphorical playbook of China's IP acquisition tactics, and I gotta say it's a little unsettling seeing it all laid out like that. But I think what really struck me is that this isn't just some like abstract issue, you know. It has real world consequences for businesses, for economies, and even for national security.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. One of the most significant impacts of these actions has been the erosion of trust, really, in the global trading system.
How so? I mean, isn't global trade all about competition? Isn't that just, part of the game?
Well, competition is one thing, but when the playing field is tilted,
Yeah.
right, because of unfair practices like forced technology transfer or IP theft, it undermines the whole system. I mean, when companies feel like their intellectual property isn't protected in a certain market, they're going to be wary of investing or doing business there.
Yeah, makes sense. Why risk pouring resources into, research and development if someone else can just come in and steal your ideas and profit from them?
Precisely. And this lack of trust, it can escalate into trade tensions, retaliatory tariffs, even economic conflict. We've seen this play out in recent years with the trade war between the U.S. and China. A significant driver of that conflict was this concern over intellectual property theft.
So it's not just about lost profits for individual companies. It can like impact entire economies and even global relationships. And it's not just Western companies that are affected, right? I remember reading that as China has become more innovative, they've also started to experience IP theft from other countries.
That's right, yeah. It's a bit ironic, isn't it? As they move up the value chain and focus on developing their own, cutting-edge technologies, they're starting to experience the same issues that Western companies have faced for years. I mean, even their own companies are stealing from each other.
So it's like they're learning the hard way that respecting intellectual property is essential for fostering innovation, economic growth.
Hmm.
What's fascinating is that it seems like this shift in perspective has actually led to some positive developments. I know China has been making efforts to like strengthen its IP laws and enforcement mechanisms in recent years.
That's true, yeah. They have. There's definitely been some progress, although there's still room for improvement for sure. The challenge is that changing a culture that's been ingrained for so long, it takes time. It's a bit like turning a giant ship, right? It doesn't happen overnight.
Okay, so on the one hand, they're becoming more aware of the importance of IP protection, but on the other hand, they still have, a long way to go. It's a complex situation, but it feels like we need to address the elephant in the room here, which is the national security implications of all of this, right? Especially when we're talking about the theft of military technology.
Absolutely. When a country gains access to sensitive military technologies through espionage or forced technology transfer, it can potentially shift the balance of power, right? It can increase the risk of conflict. It's a very serious issue.
It's like handing your adversary a blueprint for your defenses,
Yeah.
right? They suddenly know all your weaknesses and they can exploit them.
Exactly. And it's not just about stealing designs. It's about understanding the underlying technologies, the manufacturing processes, the vulnerabilities. All of that information can be used to develop countermeasures, to exploit weaknesses, even to build their own superior weapon systems.
So the implications of IP theft in the military realm go way beyond economic competition, right? It can have these direct, serious consequences for national security and global stability. It makes you wonder, how have Western companies and governments responded to all of this? I mean, have they just been sitting back and taking it?
No, no, not at all. They've taken a multi-pronged approach, really. One strategy has been to push for stronger international agreements on intellectual property protection.
So like trade deals that include provisions on IP rights, trying to establish some ground rules for how countries interact when it comes to intellectual property.
Exactly. For example, the World Trade Organization's agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, or TRIPS, that's minimum standards for IP protection among member countries. It's an attempt to create a level playing field for businesses operating globally.
Okay, so that sounds like a good starting point. But what about those countries that don't play by the rules? What happens then?
Well, there have also been bilateral agreements between countries that are aimed at addressing specific IP concerns.
Hmm.
The U.S. and China, for instance, have negotiated agreements on IP protection, although their effectiveness is a matter of debate.
It sounds like diplomacy and international agreements are a big part of the response. But what about individual companies? What can they do to protect themselves?
Yeah, well, companies have also been taking their own measures to safeguard their intellectual property. Of course, physical security is still important, but in the digital age, it's not enough. Cybersecurity has become paramount.
So building stronger firewalls, encrypting data, training employees on cybersecurity best practices, that kind of thing.
Exactly. We're seeing companies invest heavily in sophisticated security systems, employee training programs, incident response plans, all to mitigate the risks of cyber attacks, data breaches. Because let's face it, the weakest link is often human error.
Yeah, it only takes, one employee clicking on a phishing link and boom, the company's entire database is compromised. It's a constant battle. I've also heard that some companies have chosen to move their manufacturing operations to countries with stronger IP protection.
That's right. It's another strategy, although it can be a costly and complex one.
Yeah.
Companies have to weigh the benefits of lower manufacturing costs in countries like China against those risks of IP theft. It's a tough decision.
So no easy solutions then. It seems like it's a constant game of cat and mouse. As companies develop new ways to protect their IP, those seeking to steal it are also finding new ways to circumvent those measures.
It is a bit of an arms race. But beyond these defensive measures, we're also seeing a growing emphasis on offensive strategies as well. Companies and governments are becoming more proactive in identifying and pursuing those who steal intellectual property.
So going after the hackers, the counterfeiters, the individuals and organizations that are profiting from stolen IP.
Exactly. Law enforcement agencies are working more closely with companies to investigate and prosecute IP theft cases. And we've seen some high profile arrests and convictions in recent years. Governments are also using diplomatic pressure and sanctions to deter countries that engage in or support IP theft. It's a combination of carrots and sticks.
It sounds like they're taking a multifaceted approach, using a combination of diplomacy, law enforcement, and economic pressure. But is it enough? I mean, is this a problem that can actually be solved, or are we destined for this endless cycle of IP theft and retaliation?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, there's no easy answer. The future of intellectual property protection, it depends on this complex interplay of factors, right? technological advancements, economic trends, geopolitical dynamics.
So it's a bit of a crystal ball situation. We can speculate, but we can't predict the future with certainty.
Exactly. But we can look at some potential scenarios, right? One possibility is that as China continues to develop its own innovation ecosystem, they will become even more invested in protecting intellectual property, both domestically and internationally.
We talked about this earlier, right? How they're starting to experience the negative consequences of IP theft themselves. Maybe self-interest will drive them toward a stronger IP regime, and that would benefit everyone, right?
Yeah, that's the optimistic scenario. But there's also the possibility that competition between China and the West, particularly in areas like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, it will intensify, leading to even more aggressive attempts to acquire IP.
So the stakes are getting higher, right? As technology advances and the race for dominance heats up. What does that mean for global IP protection?
Well, it could lead to a more fragmented global IP landscape, with different countries or blocks adopting their own rules and standards, making it even harder to protect IP across borders.
So a more divided world when it comes to intellectual property. That doesn't sound good.
It's a real possibility. And then there's the wild card of technological disruption.
What do you mean by that?
Well, new technologies, right? Like blockchain, artificial intelligence, they have the potential to revolutionize how we create, how we protect, and how we share intellectual property.
So they could be both a solution and a problem.
Exactly. They could make it easier to track and enforce IP rights, but they could also make it even easier to steal it, to copy it.
Mm.
It's a double-edged sword, and the outcome is going to depend on how these technologies are developed and regulated.
So the future of IT protection is uncertain, to say the least. But it sounds like it's going to be a wild ride.
It is, but one thing is clear.
Yeah.
Intellectual property, it will continue to be this crucial battleground in the global economy.
And understanding the challenges and the opportunities in this area is essential for anyone involved in innovation, in business, and in policy.
Absolutely. This deep dive has just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore, to understand.
Well, on that note, let's take a short pause here. When we come back, we'll wrap up this episode with some key takeaways and some food for thought for our listeners. Welcome back. It's been quite a journey, exploring this whole world of intellectual property acquisition and especially focusing on China's strategies and how it's all playing out globally. Now, before we wrap things up, I think it'd be helpful to kind of like zoom out a bit. What are the key takeaways here? What should our listeners really be thinking about?
Yeah, if we take a step back and look at everything we've discussed, one big theme really emerges, and that's the absolute centrality of intellectual property in the 21st century, right? It's the lifeblood of the modern economy.
It's not just about, those patents and trademarks from the textbook, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about algorithms, data, trade secrets, it's like the raw material of innovation itself.
Exactly. And as we've seen, the competition for this intellectual capital is, well, it's fierce. Countries and companies, they're using a whole arsenal of tactics, both within the lines and outside of them, to get ahead.
And China, well, they haven't exactly been shy about their approach. Forced technology transfer, reverse engineering, cyber espionage, talent recruitment. They've used it all to acquire IP and fast track their rise as an economic and technological powerhouse.
Yeah, and that aggressive approach has definitely ruffled some feathers, right?
Yeah.
It's raised serious concerns about fairness, trust, global security. It's disrupted trade, fueled tensions, and made it crystal clear that we need stronger international cooperation on IP protection.
So, for businesses and individuals out there listening, what does this all mean for them? How do they navigate this increasingly complex and even kind of treacherous landscape? What can they actually do to protect themselves?
Well, I think the first line of defense is awareness, right? You can't protect yourself if you don't know what you're up against. Understanding the various ways that intellectual property can be compromised. I mean, from outright theft to those more subtle forms of acquisition, that's crucial.
It's like Sun Tzu said, know your enemy and know yourself, and in 100 battles, you will never be defeated. Okay, so we got to be aware of the tactics, but then what? Do we, like, build Fort Knox around our ideas?
Well, building a fortress is one approach, but in the digital age, cybersecurity is paramount. Think, robust firewalls, strong encryption, those annoying but necessary password protocols, the whole nine
And
yards.
let's not forget about the human element. I mean, all the fancy tech in the world won't help if someone clicks on a phishing link and hands over the keys to the kingdom.
Exactly. Employee training is just as crucial as any software upgrade.
Hmm.
Making sure your team, they understand the importance of IP protection and how to spot those potential threats. That's a huge part of the battle.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's about building a culture of security, not just relying on tech to solve everything. Now, what about those companies that are operating in countries where, IP protection is weak or enforcement is inconsistent? What can they do?
Well, due diligence is absolutely essential in those situations. Vet your partners carefully, understand the local laws and customs, and take concrete steps to protect your trade secrets. It's about managing risk in a challenging environment.
And it's not just a legal issue, right? It's also about building that culture of respect for intellectual property, within your organization and more broadly in society.
Absolutely. Innovation, it thrives when there's a level playing field and creators feel confident that their work will be protected. But I think there's an even bigger question that we need to consider, and that is, what is the role of intellectual property in this rapidly changing world, right?
Whoa, okay, now we're getting philosophical.
Think about it. Technology, it's advancing so rapidly. The lines between invention, copying, and adaptation, they're getting blurry.
Yeah, think about open source software, all that collaborative research happening online, the remix culture of the internet. It's not always clear who owns what anymore.
Exactly. And this raises some fundamental questions about how we balance the need to incentivize innovation with the need to share knowledge, to propel progress.
It's a classic dilemma. I mean, without some kind of protection, creators might not have the motivation, to pour their time and resources into research and development.
But if we cling too tightly to those IP rights, it could stifle collaboration, right?
Hmm.
And slow down the pace of innovation. It's a delicate balancing act, and it's constantly in flux.
So where does this leave us? What's the takeaway for our listeners as they think about the future of intellectual property?
I think the key is adaptability.
Right.
This isn't a static issue with a one size fits all solution. The landscape of intellectual property, it's constantly evolving. Just as technology and the global economy, they keep shifting, right? We need to be flexible, to be informed, and be prepared to adapt.
Yeah, it's like navigating a constantly changing maze. But this deep dive has given us a flashlight and a map to at least get started.
Exactly. And as always, we encourage you, our listener, to continue your own research, to have those thoughtful discussions, and most importantly, to challenge assumptions. Right, the more informed we all are, the better equipped we'll be to navigate this complex and a vitally important issue.
Well said. It's been a dense but fascinating deep dive. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the world of intellectual property and a special focus on China's strategies and their global implications. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep exploring.